All right, welcome everybody. So once again, I am Martha Hines and I am with Melanie Reinhart and Chris Skidmore. And we are here for a part 3 of an ongoing conversation we've been having now for about 7 months or so, something like that. Um, so in the very first video that the three of us recorded, back in June or July of 2023, Mars and Venus had just almost come together in Leo. And Venus was heading into the underworld, and so we had a really beautiful conversation, back 7-ish months ago. And now we are now in February of 2024, and Mars and Venus are about to actually meet for real in Aquarius. And so in this conversation today, we are going to dive into all of, various layers of what is happening in the sky at this moment and in ourselves and in the world regarding this Venus-Mars conjunction. And then so many other layers going on there, Chiron also coming to the North Node, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really looking forward to this. And these conversations are always so fulfilling for me and so enjoyable, I think, for lots of other people. So thank you, Chris and Melanie, for being here.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks for having us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lovely to be with both of you again. Had a
Yeah.
lot of fun last time we were together as we three.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yes. And I'll just mention again, we are spanning the globe yet again. So we're all on the same day. I think it's always interesting to notice that we happen to be meeting all on the same day, but I am just before sunrise. Chris is just after, well, maybe significantly after sunset, and Melanie is midday the same day. So I woke up very early, and Chris will be staying up pretty late, being together, which is beautiful. Yeah, but before we started recording, Melanie, you were describing some of the observations you're having about this time and the interplay of Pluto and Chariklo and all of that. I would love to start there.
Okay. So when I was preparing material for our conversation today, my interest sort of landed on something which I had kind of been noticing, but I didn't really take an overview until preparing for today. So what I noticed was that, well, obviously, as we all know now, Pluto's located in the very first degree of Aquarius, having entered Aquarius or re-entered Aquarius last month in January. So Pluto is like a sentinel there at the beginning of Aquarius. And then the centaur Chariklo is pretty much right in the middle of Aquarius. So what we saw just over the last couple of weeks, and it's still ongoing, was this most extraordinary sequence where one by one, led by Mercury, the guide of souls, Mercury, Mars, and Venus had to pass through a conjunction with Pluto, and then eventually, in their own time, they all reached the conjunction with Chariklo, and Venus will be the last of the cluster to reach Chariklo, and that'll be on the 28th of February. So that felt like a really important arc of something sort of gestating in the underworld And I saw those first 14 degrees like a kind of a crucible into which those planets entered one by one. While being in the crucible, the conjunction with Mars and Venus occurs, having waited quite a while with the almost conjunction last August 2023. And so to really meet with each other, they had to pass through the conjunctions of conjunctions with Pluto, and then they conjunct. So it felt to me like this image of some kind of celestial, like a celestial chalice or container within which these crucially important processes of kind of death and rebirth experiences were happening with both Venus and Mars. And then, only then do they conjunct. Now, I'm sure that probably for all you watching out there, the symbolism of that is so very obvious and very poignant. Because so often, in order to really come into a deep relationship, really of whatever kind, there are processes of transformation where it's almost like we have to clear our eyes to truly see the person beyond what we're projecting onto them, our own expectations, our own hopes and fears, or indeed our own relationship patterning that belongs to our biography, our family. So, of course, you know, our relationship with both parents and also siblings or other significant adults, the patterns thereof can just be transferred wholesale onto people that we're really close to. And the irony is that the closer the relationship, the more likely it is that that will happen. And that's not something, you know, malign. It's simply that the deeper we open, the more space is given to the obstacles that might be arising. And that can be extremely painful, as I'm sure everyone out there knows. So that process of seeing and understanding with Mars and Venus conjunct in Aquarius seems to me extremely powerful, because we're getting many chances to actually see what's happening in that process that I just described. And that can be incredibly liberating, if initially very painful. It's like we can recognize the difference between, let's call it, the ghosts of the past and the reality of the beings of light that we all are, ultimately. And I think that, you know, relationship itself, and here it's not, in my mind, limited to romantic relationships, sexual relationships, or marriage, or any kind of stock in trade description of a relationship. Because in one way or another, we spend our whole lives in relationship with other people, be they family, father, mother, siblings, etc., really close friends, work colleagues. I mean, there's such a variety of relationships. And that kind of transposition and projection can enter into the field of any relationship. And so to me, that's a big part of what this period is about on a very personal level. And it's also a kind of distillation, perhaps, or a microcosm of the bigger transition that we're all in, with Pluto going in and out of the sign of Aquarius. So, we do still have one more dip into Capricorn to go. And so right now, maybe a time when some of our hopes and wishes and ideals and cravings to do with what will happen when we go into Aquarius, they might be arising for inspection, let's say. And some of the issues that we'll be dealing with will have been laid out during this period right now that we're in. And while we may be, impatient and really wanting things to move on because it's been a couple of years of such incredibly dense and sticky energy with all the Saturn-Pluto themes. But there may still be themes that are hot and active now that won't complete as quickly as we would like to. And so being in relationship, there's that theme again, being in relationship with those things, and there can be internal things as well as relationships with people, with other people. So after Mars passes Chariklo, 2 days later, Chiron makes a conjunction with the north node of the moon. That's the mean north node. In other words, the average position of the north node. And in a way, that kind of, in my mind, that's the culmination of this little sequence. Note, however, that Chiron remains within range of conjunct the mean node for a further many weeks, actually. In fact, it kicked in, I think, at the last station of Chiron, which was just before Christmas, and then began to move into this new situation of being conjunct the north node. So it was already within range then, and 5th of March, it's the exact conjunction with the mean node, and then so give it another 3 months, it'll still be within range, and of course very significant in the little thread that we're following, because Mars rules Aries, so Mars rules Chiron and the north node at the moment. And as far as Venus and her rulership, well, in April, on the 21st, there'll be a conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus in Taurus, which of course is ruled by Venus. So pretty much everywhere you look at the moment, the themes of Venus and Mars seem to stand out. And at least in my mind, maybe just because I've been looking out for it, who knows, but it really is there if you dig a bit.
And then Uranus is ruling Aquarius.
Yes.
It all goes,
Of course.
it all
Yes.
fits. Could I share something that this interestingly?
Yeah. Please go on.
Yeah. So I'm just reflecting on this as you're talking. Yesterday in my prayers, every day in my prayers, I at the end of my prayers, I ask, what is mine to do? So yesterday I was shown this image, which wasn't meant to be literal, it's metaphorical, but it was essentially the feminine and the masculine coming together, in union, right? But as their essence, like the purity, it felt like more like the Aquarian essence of the divine feminine and the divine masculine coming together. And they came into this union. And what I felt in that, just on my emotional body level, was this feeling of, in both of them, a grief, like grief that they needed to acknowledge together, of what felt to me like still processing a lot of the Capricorn, like the Pluto and Capricorn energy of, moving beyond and bringing up the traumas and the hurt that's gone on in our world and with each other, And it felt, so it really, really fits with what you're saying, because it felt like there's like it was time for them to come together, yet there was still stuff that needed to be processed. You know, even though they're coming together as the purity of the essence of who they are, still they're both grieving. At least that's how I was feeling. They're both grieving all of the pain that's gone on. And so that does seem to speak to what you're saying, that in this year, it's when we're making this transition, it's not about an instantaneous moment that suddenly everything's perfect. That's not the point to me. It really is a process, and being really present with what's true and real, and the vision of what's ultimately the ultimate truth, like that more Aquarian Uranian light that we are, and yet being present with what we have experienced in our earth bodies. I don't know if how that fits for you, but
I think that's lovely, Martha, really. Almost as if, you know, one of the hazards in the sign of Aquarius can be the gap between what is here and now and how we would like it to be. And it's such a two-edged thing, because from one point of view, because there would never be any kind of evolution if people didn't have an idea that they followed to the end and invented something great or did something great, etc. But the gap between those two is a very significant place, I think, because that gap also gives us a chance to be patient enough to see where we're not seeing clearly. So the spaciousness of the great sky is how I think of Aquarius, where there's space for everything. And so it's an education in what we tend to edit out or delete or obscure that we don't want to see. But the Aquarian field, I think, is capable of holding and containing a big variety of pairs of opposites. You know, it's the last one of the air signs. So the previous two being Libra, and the earliest one in the zodiac is Gemini. And in the overall sequence of the zodiac, that's the sign which has a very intense and sometimes painful focus on the opposites. And in a way, learning how to stop trying to mash the opposites together, prompted by the pain of the lost sense of unity, is very acute in Gemini. And there we have to learn to let opposites be, and without feeling that it's a problem that we have to fix, or that we have to mash them together to get a kind of a unity, and so on. And you could take that theme of duality and unity very clearly in steps between the air signs. But by the time we get round to Aquarius, it's almost like those other teachings from Gemini and Libra ideally would have been absorbed to quite some degree. And then in Aquarius, it includes different ways of relating to the opposites and so forth. But it sort of has the potential to take things onto a whole other level. You know, more global, more universal, more transcendent in the end. And so it's a sign in which, you know, a lot can be evoked because there's space for it, you know, ideally.
Chris. anything arising for you?
Well, when you just said double-edged, that was quite a vivid. I just got the real glyph of Aquarius when you said double-edged,
Oh,
because of course there's the up down of the two edges, and then also the two-ness of the top and the bottom. And so it's
yes.
just like it really just came in a bit of a flash, which is a bit Aquarian, isn't it? Where the idea of not only the double-edgedness of it, but the as you said, the gap between what is and how you would like it to be, maybe exists in that blank space in between the top edginess and the bottom edginess. And so the more I kind of was toying around with that in my head, I could feel the charge of opposites in a way. But as you say, we hope that having gone through Gemini, then Libra, and then moving into Aquarius, there's a sense of being able to have space for everything. But also in the having space for everything, there's such intense charge. And then so I'm sort of like thinking then of Pluto stands at the threshold, and then here come all these little guys, Mercury, Venus, and Mars coming through the threshold where Pluto is. And I wonder how that is in between. Maybe that's something we can feel in between the upheaval of Pluto, and then perhaps arriving when we eventually get to Chariklo, the half a sign that stands in between the kind of what could be complete meaningless and chaotic upheaval energy, and then maybe arriving into Chariklo. There seems to be a sense of patience and waiting, because and maybe it's helpful, I don't know, for me it feels helpful to know that Chariklo is in there in the middle of the sign, so that you sort of are going towards somebody, and of all the people to be there, of all the spirits to be there, Chariklo would be the one that you'd want to be there, wouldn't she?
Exactly.
So she feels to me quite prominent from what you were saying as I was picking up your images. Obviously, so much of the Mars Venus, a little mythologem just kind of popped in, but I'll get back to that later. But I think Chariklo really, she stands out for me. So I mean, maybe we could have you guys, I don't know, give us more, because maybe people who are listening, they're like, who is Chariklo? I don't know. We've talked about it maybe a little in our series, but
that was exactly where my mind was going too. I was going to ask Melanie, to say more, and of course, just to tie in, Melanie can say more, but Chariklo is Chiron's wife, right? So we have Chiron on the north node, and I'm getting this image, when you're a little kid or you're with a small child in a swimming pool and they're learning how to swim, and so I imagine Chariklo almost like, okay, come over here, come, I'm waiting, like I catch you, that's the image that was coming to me. And then we have her husband Chiron sitting there on the north node. It's like so fascinating.
Oh, that's really beautiful. And I'm thinking, just embroidering on your image, Martha, it makes me think of a child who's maybe a bit scared of the water. And so having Chariklo as a kind of encouragement, waiting there with hands out, ready to grab the little one. And Chiron maybe on the other side of the pool or whatever, maybe feeling hugely proud that this little kid is brave enough to undergo the feeling of complete panic. I can remember my first swimming lesson. I thought I was going to die. I was absolutely terrified. And I'm just thinking how wonderful it would be to be in the first stages of learning how to swim, and having a pair like that, Chariklo and Chiron, as one's parents or swimming teachers or mentors or whatever. The one encouraging and feeling the confidence and bravery vicariously, and the other one, Chariklo, kind of encouraging forward with open arms, or maybe leaning in towards the pool, this kind of thing.
This is quite comical because I can also feel the other side of that. My experience of learning to swim was with quite a lovely lady, kind of one of the aunts, one of the non-family aunts, you know, all those aunties that I remember from my childhood. And one of my aunties, her way of teaching me to swim and us to swim was just throw you in the pool. So it's very much the opposite of the Chariklo experience. And then it's like, but that would be maybe the Pluto, like, can you swim? We'll find out. Swim or die.
Yeah, right. Swim or die. Oh, amazing. So I know from a number of people I've been speaking with that the last couple of weeks have included at least one experience which felt like being thrown in at the deep end, you know, sink or swim, die or swim.
That's the one that feels a bit more like, I don't know, personally relevant.
Yeah. Yes.
And you know
swim
what?
Or die. Let's go.
Yeah, well, and I would love Melanie to talk a little bit about Chariklo, but I'll just add in, this is so interesting because when Pluto was in January, was just about to enter Aquarius for the second time, I recorded a video about it, and what I said in there actually, this is actually so perfect. Wow. What I said was that the feeling I was getting was that last March in 2023, when Pluto went in first time, Pluto went into Aquarius, I had this image of a lake, right? And it's like we sort of walked into that lake, maybe up to our calves or something. We experienced Pluto and Aquarius for just a few months, a little while, but then we went back onto the land of Capricorn. And now it's like we're submerging ourselves into the lake, but we're still just sort of trying it out for whatever it is, 7 months or something. But then it'll be next November when we really swim, right? So, so all these metaphors are
interesting. And interesting because, of course, Aquarius is the water bearer.
Yes, right.
Images are lakes and swimming pools and all the rest of it.
Yeah. But Melanie, maybe give people a sense of Chariklo.
Sure, if I can.
Or the Chariklo.
Yes, so as Martha said, Chariklo is actually the wife of Chiron, and she was discovered on Valentine's Day in 1997. And a number of things of interest about her astronomically. She's the largest one of the centaurs discovered so far, and her orbit is the most stable of the centaurs discovered so far. So the most unstable of the orbits of the centaurs discovered thus far is Chiron. So there's a pair of opposites for you. The most stable orbit and the most unstable orbit, which is fascinating. Chiron, I was going to say Chariklo there, and I said Chiron. Chariklo began her life as a nymph, depending on which source you read. That was a wood nymph or a water nymph. So here's the water again. And what's so interesting is, to my knowledge, I'm still looking, but to my knowledge, there's no existing account in the texts as to how come she got to be a centaur in order to be with Chiron. In other words, did she shapeshift? And we know that mythical creatures and in mythical stories, that's par for the course. It often happens, but it's not specifically reported. So did she shapeshift? And did she shapeshift in order to be with Chiron? There are other mythical stories, like the one about the mermaid, you know? who changed into a human in order to be with her beloved. So we don't know if it's that, or if there was somehow some kind of trans-species union that occurred between Chariklo and Chiron. But we do know they did actually have offspring, which is very interesting because actually most hybrid animals do not reproduce, like donkeys. So they are both hybrids. Chariklo may be like a triple hybrid, you know, or double hybrid from nymph to centaur, etc. So there's what I love about these scant details that we do have about some of the versions of the story is that there are enough holes in the story, you know, into which our own intuitions and our own personal psyche can flow. So there's plenty of room for us in the story. It's not a cut and dried thing. And one astrologer has even suggested that it was that Chariklo never fully incarnated into her next stage. So, you know, was she a nymph? Was she a centaur? We don't really know. But I love the idea that she wasn't fully incarnated into the plane of the centaurs, let's say. Because that then makes her into some kind of spiritual guide for Chiron, existing maybe mostly in another dimension, but certainly in the centaur world sufficiently to mate with Chiron, and she gave birth to offspring. So there's like questions all over the story where things just totally don't make sense. And that's one of the charming things about it, to me. And there was something else I was going to say about the, oh yes, because, you know, the notion of Chariklo in some less substantial, more ethereal dimension as a partner to Chiron. Now, that reminded me immediately of the magnificent story of Dante and Beatrice. So there's a very famous book, which maybe many of you have read, and it's called The Divine Comedy. And this is not actually comedy in the sense of ha, it's funny. But the word commedia in the ancient Italian, that was almost like a genre of story whereby things ended happily. So it doesn't mean where it's funny all the time, with different meaning there. And it's in 3 parts. It's l'inferno, hell, purgatorio, purgatory, and then paradiso. So it's very long. It's in 3 parts. But what made me think of it now is the fact that, so Beatrice was an early love of Dante's, and she died very young, before the relationship could ever be established or even consummated and everything. So the memory of Beatrice and the love that he felt for her was like the guiding star of Dante's life. And so she shows up in the Commedia as his spiritual guide when he's down in the underworld. And so there's an element of that which we could perhaps link with the story of Chariklo and Chiron. I personally love that because I'm a huge fan of that story. And if any of you are interested, there's a magnificent commentary written on it. It was published a few years ago on the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante. And it's by Mark Vernon. You can find him online as well. And this story is one which I have felt so gripped by for much of my life, that every once in a while I undertake the rereading of all 700 or something pages of it, or at least find a new commentary, but anyway, immerse myself in it. And to me, it's a story for these times, in the sense of Pluto changing signs. And next year, we know there are more things also changing signs. But the sense of emerging from a very, very dark place. And so, reading the whole thing, it's almost as if it's a healing piece of literature. Because if you can give yourself over to the story, you will start out in a very dark, probably you're already in a very dark place, which is why you were drawn to read it. And you probably will relate very strongly to each one of the phases, particularly in Mark Vernon's commentary. So there's something about Chariklo, in my mind, is something like Beatrice to Dante. In terms of the qualities, her particular dimension of healing seems to be where we could say the very yin aspect of the healing process. And that I wouldn't want to, make a hard and fast division there and say, well, Chiron is the yang part of healing and Chariklo is the yin part of healing, because of course both will have to be there together in any healing process. But Chariklo seems to resonate very strongly with the dimension of the healing process, which is about the capacity to hold the sacred space, so that something way beyond our human capacities can freely enter into the situation. So containing, holding space, and being able to bear witness, by which I mean being able to be with something in such a way that the agitation to fix it or make it better doesn't get in the way of what is trying to happen anyway from the deeper levels. And I'm sure we all know that there are a lot of things that we're hearing and seeing through the media these days, which I frankly sometimes find utterly impossible to be with without reacting. And so there's something about Chariklo's capacity for exactly that. And it shows up big time in the charts of healers, particularly healers who are working mainly through a skill of being able to really be there, quiet enough and still enough to sense the subtle energies that move in the body and soul, and being able to respect that and accompany it and let the healing itself be the major agent without doing much. I remember the first time I had a craniosacral treatment was actually a craniosacral osteopath. And I started laughing in the middle of my session because there was so much going on internally at the level of my own body energies, and not only body, but other energies. And I started laughing because I suddenly had this kind of through the window view. And I thought, wow, somebody looking into what's going on in this session will think the person's ripping me off, because there they are, not doing anything for an hour or whatever, and then I'm paying them. I laughed so much. Probably the laughter was part of the treatment. But anyway, it's like that. It's the power of what goes on invisibly And it's not that that has to be revealed or we need to understand it. It's just a kind of quiet acceptance of the mystery, in that there are always things going on behind the scenes, invisibly, in our own hearts, in the environment, etc. And so the interface, the kind of natural interface between those dimensions and those worlds, seems to me that's a big feature of what Chariklo is about.
Mm.
So I'm sure both of you have worked with Chariklo, so please say what you've experienced.
Well, I would love to hear Chris. For me, Chariklo happens to be conjunct my Venus, South Node, and Chiron. I mean, so
Okay.
Chiron and Chariklo are, a few degrees apart, but they both are basically, they're both basically conjunct my Venus and South Node. They sandwich my Venus and South Node. Yeah. And I would say, for me, I've been thinking about, I'm starting this astrology course, which both of you are speakers in, actually. And I was sitting with the first couple of sessions where we've already started that course, and it was dawning on me that if I could convey one thing, literally one thing in that course, but in my life, it would be how to just simply be present, period. The end. And I think back to my time. I mean, Chris and I both are, craniosacral therapists and psychotherapists, right? But I think back to my time as a psychotherapist, working with children in the child welfare system, so the highly, highly traumatized kids. And I think of some of the most profound sessions I had with those children were the ones where I didn't say anything. I literally would just sit there, and there would be, sand tray or like things of art or whatever that they would be engaging with, and I would sit, and it would be like this this golden light would just come into the room and then click, and it would just become this like almost like very gently but powerfully sort of pulsating container would just be there.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then within 30 minutes of just observing, not saying anything, I would know, a 3-year-old is sitting there playing with sand tray or whatever it was, and I knew everything about them, everything about what they felt about every person in their life, all the trauma that had occurred. So a lot of what I was doing was assessing the abuse that had gone on, right? And what I learned pretty quickly was I got the most by not saying anything, by not asking anything. I mean, not always, but it was just fascinating to me. And I'm not advocating not saying anything in sessions. That's not what I'm saying, but I think you get the point. It's like the power of just that, I feel like, is probably the number one thing
and, certainly in my experience, it's possible to be in a kind of a state connected with that Chariklo energy, or even inviting it, and be talking a whole lot.
Oh, definitely. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Because it's a kind of invisible vibration state. And I find that that it's mostly by analogy that I can say anything at all about Chariklo. There's something so preciously elusive and incomprehensible about her. So there's really very little detail in the mythology about her, which I think is lovely, because then, as I said, that leaves plenty of space for us to build our own personal connection with this energy. And in my experience, certainly, it's it's like once you described about the golden light coming, and then you said click. I can 100% understand what you mean by that. It's almost like click, and there she is in the room,
Wow.
It actually reminds me of I think of the mythology at the heart of craniosacral therapy, actually, because there is a mythology there. You generally just kind of have to hear the stories, like, how did this thing come to be, right? How did this thing craniosacral come to be? And the story that I think is quite mythic is I think he's a 19th century osteopath called A.T. Still. His name is A.T. Still.
Oh.
And he and as an osteopath, as he, or he was doing a lot of physical work, right? And he just kept having these patients where he'd do the work and they'd be like, thanks, doc, that feels so good. And then 2 weeks later, they'd be back with the exact same condition, the exact same conundrum. And so he'd keep moving something, fixing it, but then they just kept coming back. And so he was just at a bit of a loss in one of his sessions, where this one client just for some reason, all of the things that he was doing wasn't quite getting there. And so she was there on the massage table or bed or whatever it was that they're using. And he just sat at her feet and just put his hands on her feet and just sort of like sat there like this, kind of basically thinking like, I don't know what to do, and because he'd just gotten to that point where he was pretty much just, it seems to me, in this mythological moment, out of ideas, it was like he'd been birthed out of the hero's story, like the story was moving on. And that's why I think some of these symbols, if we get back to the Mars, Venus, and everything happening in Aquarius, it's like, it's the opposite sign to Leo, right? It's the, it perhaps gives us a way to move on from the hero's journey, actually, to move on from the insistence upon heroism, which in a way is a control mechanism, right? Like, I mean, anyway, there's lots of places to go there. But as he was sitting there, 20 minutes went by or something, and then he went to his patient and says, anyway, and she said, like, wow, that was amazing. All these things just happened, and like, I feel so much better, doc, please, can we do this again next week? And he's like, do what again? What just happened there, right? And that was as I understand it, and whether this is all factually, who cares? It's like the myth underneath it is this sort of end of doing thing where instead it's like, maybe we could imagine that his hand was taken by Chariklo, and it was this kind of like, hey, listen, just put them there, don't do anything else, see what happens. And that became the experiment, right? What would happen if instead of, like, to me, that whole work is you want to detect the thing that's going wrong as clearly as you possibly can, and then resist the urge to fix it. That was how I was taught it by my mentor in all of those 7 years that we spent together. Like, it was like, resist the urge to fix it. I'm like, but I really want to, there's this constant urge, because we all have the heroic impulse, right? The Mars impulse, basically, which is like, I see the thing that's wrong, I want to fix it. And that's the exact urge that one has to, I mean, this mentor of mine, he spent 9 years with Ramesh, who's a guru in India, and his whole thing was, you are not the doer. So it all came back to that one basic message. And of course, you've got to sit with the guru to really take in everything that that's about. But I remember really feeling that in his teachings of you're not the doer. So then if anything's going to heal this body and heal this person on the table, or heal this planet, or heal the rift between men and women, or masculine, feminine, and the this versus thatness of things. You know, it's going to have to be, it's just going to have to be like that, isn't it? It's going to have to be a sense of holding just what Aquarius ultimately nudges us towards. But within the Aquarian archetype, there's all those spikes, right? But it nudges our awareness towards, what if you could make space for all of these wild oppositions, some of them violent towards each other? What if you could continue to hold and make space? And I feel like we're consistently, you know, maybe the evolution of our species, it's so hard to do that, actually. That's why I feel that, you know, people, when I'm talking about my craniosacral journey, I'm like, you know, I just had to learn to do nothing. But it took me like 15 years.
Yeah.
It seems like, oh, you just do nothing, but actually that's a quite a dramatic challenge, because of, and you even mentioned it, Melanie, when the idea that someone's actually paying for this, and so there's all these other programs that click in, and so so we get back into that Herculean, you know, that heroic stance of wanting to be the one who heals and fixes and changes and does the things, and then can be celebrated and applauded for all of that. So it can be hard to get off of all of those paradigms and off of all of that. And it's a lot of trust, because you've got to be willing actually to sit there and do what is essentially nothing. But what I find in this Chariklo energy is there's an incredibly heightened and widened observation field for what's going on. And without that, and the doing nothing, that you're actually doing nothing. But with the doing nothing plus that widening of your perception, that's where the magic is, I think.
Yeah, that's a beautiful description of what I would label as witnessing.
And that actually ties in also the biggest thing that I'm feeling so called into, even in just my approach of quote unquote teaching astrology, or, you know, being with life, is exactly that, is that I feel like there's such this tendency to want to feel like we're supposed to have answers, and we're supposed to know things, right? And so what I feel like often gets lost in many areas of life, but even in astrology, is if we think we know something, then suddenly we're not actually present with all of what actually is here, right?
Yes.
And I feel, and things like, we know this, things there's a healing that happens just simply by something else witnessing, like you're saying, Melanie, just the witnessing of who we actually are suddenly lets us be who we actually are. And that, I feel like, is one of the biggest gifts we can give to anything. But it takes the stepping back and being willing to quote unquote do nothing, I think, a lot of the time, to give that.
Well, it's interesting, what comes up for me, I was listening to Jason Holly on Astro University. He had the Uranus thing that he was doing, and one of the things he mentions was the Children of Uranus, the Cyclopses and the Hecatoncres, right? So the Cyclops has the one eye, so that is like the single point of vision, but there's no depth perception, right? So if you have one eye, you can't have a depth perception. So that's one perhaps risk of the archetypal Uranian impulse. And the other is the Hecatoncres with the 100 hands, or the 50 heads, 100 hands. This one that's doing, right? Like if you have 100 hands, then that's the other side of it, where you're in the constant state of doing, or what I find that to be symbolic of. So on the one hand, the single eye that has not the depth perception and too crisp a knowing, in a sense, like I know this and only this, and without two eyes, you can't see that other thing. You just kind of get fully focused in there. And then the Hecatoncres, with their 100 hands. So some kind of images that also
Wonderful.
help us, I think, with a bit of the shadow Aquarian impulse that is here. Because although Aquarius as an impulse has the desire to understand all things and therefore have enough of a width of perception to take it all in, including the opposite of my own view, right? The shadow would perhaps be the children of Uranus, the Cyclops and the Hecatoncrates.
Oh, I love that.
Thanks, Jason, for some of those hints in that direction. Yeah.
Melanie, were you about to say something a minute ago, Melanie? Or
If I was, I've forgotten already.
yeah. Well, so then, I mean, so yeah, so I mean, I think we've kind of talked. Oh, wait, sorry. No, okay, I'm going to ask you a question actually that is related to Chariklo that may or may not be related to this exact conversation, but I would love to ask you this question, Melanie, and Chris too, if you have thoughts. Something I sit with Chariklo energy, and I think probably a lot of people sit with is when I feel into that Chariklo energy in myself and in the world, and given I have a lot of Piscean energy too, right? My Pisces sun in my 7th house. Okay, so I have all these energies that could have a tendency to just be present for everything. And so then the question often is, what does Chariklo get out of this? How does she get taken care of, right? So I think of Chariklo, the actual physical being with the rings, and that's something that I wonder if there's some way in which that's symbolic of some kind of boundaries she has, so I don't know if you have any feelings or thoughts about Chariklo's self. Do you kind of get what I'm asking?
Yeah, well, one thing that comes to mind, which in a way isn't an answer, it's not an answer to your question, but it's a response to it, is the fact that so her husband, Chiron, his orbit actually crosses through the orbit of Saturn. And it goes out as far as the orbit of Uranus, but it doesn't actually cross over it. Now, Chariklo is the only centaur whose orbit does not cross the orbit of any of the other planets, but it goes neatly in between Saturn and Uranus, the dual rulers of Aquarius. I actually wonder if Chariklo could be said to be ruled by, say it again. I wondered if Chariklo could be said to be one of the rulers of Aquarius, given that it's there in the astronomy. So she doesn't disrupt anybody else's orbit. Or it's not her job to kind of cut through Saturn and open the pathway.
And her orbit is the most sort of circular, right? Of the 4 main centaurs, the other ones are much more.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd have to check that, but I think that's right. And yes, she does have rings. And so back in 2016, there was a speculation that Chiron might also have rings. And this is so fabulous, at least I think. So more recently, very recently, new observations or new technology or new Uranus things, okay, have discovered that actually what they thought was rings around Chiron is not rings. Let me remember the phrase or I'll spoil this anecdote. Yes, they discovered what they called a transformational process, right, going on in the area where they thought it was rings. And so the speculation is that these things are on their way to being or becoming phenomena that could be identified as rings. But in the meantime, they're not quite there yet.
Wow.
And so forth. And I just thought that was so wonderful.
Mm.
It's not clear from the research as to whether this phenomenon, the transformational zone or process or something like that, it's not clear whether they're on their way to becoming rings or whether the material will disperse or what. The major speculation seems to be that this zone is on the way to becoming rings.
Wow.
And, I can't resist, the phrase wedding rings. Of course, comes to mind with all the involvement of Valentine's Day, Chiron's perihelion and Chariklo's discovery. So why wouldn't they have wedding rings, All kind of makes sense. But to return to your question, so the fact that her orbit is contained between Saturn and Uranus, to me speaks volumes, because she inhabits or represents a state of consciousness which is beyond the rasping either or type of mentality that gets set in when Saturn and Uranus are in aspect to each other, or even, that can be said to represent the children of Uranus that you just described so beautifully. So Chariklo is there between the opposites, and that edge between Saturn and Uranus, it's a major, major threshold. I mean, we forget that because it's a long time now that Uranus has been around. But if you think about it, Uranus was the first planet to be discovered with maths and technology. So it's mostly not visible, although I believe that in some latitudes, some sharp-eyed people can see it, whatever, but in the main, it's not visible. It's not a regular thing that we see easily in the night sky. And so that it's like the edge between what can be apprehended through our regular five senses and a level where those five senses are not sufficient. Okay. Other senses, because we have plenty of other senses. Heard a radio program where they said there's now 42 senses that are being explored. All kinds of wonderful names and things they do and all that. But anyway, Uranus is beyond the world of the normal five senses. And what a huge threshold that is for all of us. Anybody who lives on Earth is in some kind of relationship with that edge. We talk about being over the edge, meaning someone's gone crazy. We don't have a word for the kind of madness where you're stuck on the other side and you cannot even get to the edge. But we should have maybe a word for that. So Chariklo represents that space that can be held without tumbling into an either or, which of course spins off into polarity and conflict and shame and blame and all the things that we're drowning in on the planet at the moment. But she's able to hold that in-between space. And it is a very challenging space because on one level, there's nothing to hang on to. And I think part of the journey to that space, I think maybe the art of consistently, serially confronting the opposites and understanding that everything has its own shadow side, its own distortions, all of that. And of course, everything that may start out seeming to us like being in hell can end up with a heavenly experience. And I know I'm not just being Pollyanna-ish when I say that. I'm way too old for that. But truly, we often get caught in our own descriptions of what we think is happening, but we don't even really know that. Truth be told, we've got our descriptions, plenty of them, like all the children of Uranus. I love that, love that. So our own thoughts proliferate, and we create a lot of drama and disaster in our own minds. And it's not to say whether or not that's true in a literal physical way. It's true in our experience. And so it's very hard, but eminently possible to develop the art of being willing to notice and to feel the duality that we do inhabit. And I think it's quite common for people who awaken to a spiritual path. It's quite common that people get very fixated on the notion of the one and only, and so forth. We have loads of religions all focused on the one, and we can see quite easily what happens when people get fixated on the one. Because, you know, back home in the realm of duality, that means two people can't have the one. If there is one, then there really is only one. And if my one doesn't look like your one, my whole world will crash and burn, unless I can make sure that my one wins. This is how it goes, you know. So I think that it's in the alchemy that goes on between Saturn and Uranus, which of course is the territory of Aquarius. That's the place where we can connect with that kind of a discernment, I think, you know. And I love the idea of Chariklo kind of living quietly and unobtrusively between Saturn and Uranus. So Saturn and Uranus, in any shape or form, when they connect, that is a strong likelihood of high drama, including horrible tragedies of destruction, you know.
Mm.
Well,
So it's like Chariklo doesn't need to cut through anything. I like to think of her kind of quietly minding her own business there, without having to participate in enormous dramas. So she can know about them, be there, and witness without necessarily having to take sides or make a huge drama and so on. That's how I sense that energy. And I think, you know, to me, because of what we've all been saying about witnessing and the wordlessness of it, I find it really difficult to speak about Chariklo. I think one can perhaps best convey by analogy or by examples and so forth. And indeed, that's what happened for me. Oh, and I'd like to just mention that there's forthcoming a collection of essays about the centaurs, and that will be published by Praesepe Press, and that's forthcoming. Publication date hasn't been confirmed yet, but it's coming. And I have written about Chariklo in there. It was so difficult to write. And I think that's part of her charm. You know, we know that Chiron has a sort of unpin-downable quality, definitely. Because I think his processes, and therefore also Chariklo, they're not really so relevant for personality, right? personality or character, like they used to write about character, and still do in astrology books, or personality, you know. But it takes us into processes that are, by their very nature, designed to open up that realm. So it's not something that we can identify with in the same way as, you know, standard descriptions of what Venus or Mercury are about. They work and they fit. But, you know, Chariklo is not a planet, nor is Chiron. A minor planet, yes, but not a major planet, not one of the Olympians and all of that. Belongs to a whole other system, which accompanies the awakening of whole other understandings and faculties in us, which can't be drummed up to order, you know. So again, can't do them, but you can clear the space and invite that kind of a perception. I've gone way beyond the question you asked.
No.
I just went off on a whole riff instead.
So beautiful. Two things arise for me in particular. One is when you're talking about the potentially developing rings of Chiron, that again emphasizes for me this need. What I've been feeling is, and actually what you're just saying about the different quality of the centaurs compared with the main planets, is again I feel over and over and over again this need to simply be present with all of these beings of the cosmos, and to recognize that nothing is static. Like literally Chiron might be developing rings right now, right? So if we as humans decide that we need to know who they are and then fixate on that answer, we're, in a way, it feels like we're almost violating them. And then in a sense, violating ourselves.
I 100% understand that.
Mm.
And I will tell you a personal anecdote.
Mm.
When I was writing Chiron, Chiron and the Healing Journey, I would sometimes wake in the middle of the night in a state of absolute horror. And the horror was that I would have spent, you know, years doing all this research and writing the book and so on, and write something which nobody was going to read. That was like the ego level of the horror. I mean,
that did not come true. That you didn't need to worry about that.
But together with that, I remember, so in London every Easter, there was a tradition that the St. Matthew Passion would be sung and played at one of the main concert halls on the South Bank. And it was a big event, you know, usually around springtime, part 1 in the morning, long lunchtime, part 2 in the afternoon. And people would bring their picnics and, you know, go out on the lawn. And I always would round up a collection of friends who were interested to go. And there was this one year, I remember, I could not stop crying. And, you know, I managed to do that without making a scene. I contained it fairly well. But I could not stop crying, and I was a mess by lunchtime. So one of the friends who I brought with me, you know, was very concerned, and she said, "Wow, you know, what's wrong?" So it is a very sad piece because it ends before the resurrection. Okay. But all I could think of was how writing this book on Chiron, I just said to my friend, I'm butchering this precious material and I cannot bear it.
Oh no.
No, I don't want to do it anymore because I'm butchering it. No, honestly.
Wow.
And there's something, and anybody who creates anything at all will know this. This is not news. There's something that can feel so violent about the process of trying to manifest something, creating something. And it's a very awe-inspiring thing, because you feel kind of mashed up. Oh, and this also happened to be during a year of the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, 1987, I think it was. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So
But
I think absolutely what you said.
to be honest, Melanie, I think that's one of the reasons I'm so drawn to you and I resonate with you so much is probably that underlying tendency in you. Plus also in general, all of your
You
humility.
mean to butcher my work, haha.
No, but that you would have that sensitivity, right? Yes. Thank you for, I mean, I'm sorry for your suffering and but also I feel like that's it, that you actually care and you're really trying to pay attention. Yeah, I mean, anyway, I could go on and on. That's beautiful. Okay. Chris, were you about to say something?
Well, I mean, that process reminds me of Uranus. I mean, what he does with the Cyclopses and the Hecatoncres, right, is he shoves them back into the earth, into Gaia, because of that very impulse, right? I mean, if the original Skyfather Uranus has that impulse, then it refers to our impulse too, right?
Yes.
Because as soon as something comes through into the earth realm, as in is manifest and becomes Saturnian, it's not perfect by definition, right? Like there's many turns that you took that you could have taken otherwise, and you could have perfected this thing. And to me, an element that I'm really looking at in the Uranian and perhaps then Aquarian conundrum is around perfection, and is around the shoving of the children back into Gaia, which kind of begins the whole process in the first place, right? That's the original dysfunctional relationship, parental relationship between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, which I really see now as coming to a big culmination, right? Because there is that split still between Sky Father, Earth Mother, Uranus, and Gaia. But yeah, butchering is an interesting word as well. It's this kind of, yeah, like we're that Uranian part in us, I think, is always thinking that we're butchering it. I think because compared to the perfection of not expressing it and just continuing to hold it in idea form, it's always going to be ugly by comparison, no matter what it is. And that's why so many artists have such a hard time, right? Because that vision that they have, or maybe we're all artists in a way, right? That vision that we have in our mind's eye, and then when it comes through Gaia and gets brought into creation, it's just never going to be as good as the vision.
Well, Chris, what you've just said, I think this may be one of the most important lessons for all of us as we do enter these very strong Aquarian energies, is exactly that gap.
That gap, yeah.
And how to navigate that gap, or be in that gap, or and so to me, I think of Chariklo.
Yeah. Yeah. No, finish.
No, I was just thinking again of the relationship between Chariklo and Aquarius in general. It seems to me there's a really strong link there.
Yes, and actually that's bringing me to an image also that I was thinking of when you were talking a minute ago. That's what I was jumping to, was the Chariklo. What was coming to me is this image I've been getting shown in my prayers for years now, but it's been especially strong lately, and I'm recognizing maybe this is a Chariklo and Aquarius kind of an energy, which is that in my prayers, every day or most days, I get taken out of the time-space continuum into the void. And then what I feel are these massive beings holding space for the whole time-space continuum. And that includes everything, right? It includes suffering, it includes pain, it includes the Cyclops, it includes it includes love, it includes war, it includes all of it. And their role, and I feel like on an ultimate level, I think a lot of our souls are maybe doing this, is just holding that space for literally everything. And so that's what I'm thinking of when I think of, like, as you're describing Chariklo in Aquarius, maybe as a ruler of Aquarius. How does that fit or not fit for you?
Fits for me.
Mm.
Yeah, I loved what you just described there.
There's quite
And
a, I was just going to say that there's quite a click happening between Chariklo now and Aquarius as the conversation's going on, because I'm even thinking back to the craniosacral conversation. What really fascinated me originally about this work was the idea of the relationship between observer and observed, right? And that there's an inextricable, quite obvious link, which is why there's no need to do anything, because you're already in the observer role. And that in itself will be the relationship that'll create the change in ways that you can't quite fathom. But then how's that for a high level Aquarian impulse then? Because Aquarius is the observer, no? I mean, that's kind of like one of the elements of that sign. So then at a high level of that, to observe in the way that Chariklo is able to observe, with the neutrality that actually takes, plus something else she's obviously bringing that is hard to name and hard to put to words, but something like compassion. Obviously, she's with suffering, so compassion goes along. You know, the amount of suffering she is witness to and around, and even Chiron suffering. But to be able to hold all of that and remain in the observer role, yeah, I'm really getting that link now between Chariklo and Aquarius.
And Aquarius, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also bringing me back to that image I mentioned at the beginning, where what I was shown in my prayers yesterday, of the feminine and the masculine being together in their sort of Aquarian, Uranian light essence beings, right? But what they're in me, what they're feeling is the grief, is the so it's not, they're not just feeling like bliss light. It's that they're very present with all of it, and that it feels, again, like another sort of maybe imbalanced Aquarian Uranian energy can be the dissociating. So Uranus is in Taurus right now. And so it feels like it's such a key thing maybe for us to also just to remember that it's okay, whatever we are, whatever is true here, even if we're holding the light of that higher vibrational reality, it's all of reality is still here, and we're present with everything, with all of it. And then maybe that's what we need in this healing time, like Mars. Maybe we can kind of start to bring this to a close a little bit, but with, say a little bit about the Mars Venus stuff. But one thing coming to me is that if Venus and Mars are now finally joining and in Aquarius with this Chariklo, having just moved through the Pluto underworld, maybe part of this time, as Pluto is in Aquarius for this second little set of time, maybe part of it is like our journey with it maybe can be just to notice, just be present. What is here in our being, in our body, in ourselves? What does need to still move? What do we need to cry about or talk about? I don't know. Anyway, any thoughts arising with that, or with like, I would love to hear your thoughts on what would be your hope, what would be sort of advice or thoughts you have about especially this next several months, where we will have Pluto kind of dunking into that lake of Aquarius for a while. And it feels like right now we're being ushered into that, in a sense. I don't know what comes up for you about how we can be being with this time.
Well, you know, I think that being able, just thinking here of Aquarius and the water bearer. So being able to drink of that water is perhaps a nice metaphor for some of the states of being that we've been sort of tentatively trying to point to in this conversation. So to the extent that we have access to that, even if we don't feel evolved enough to dwell 100% of the time there, the sense of inclusion that Aquarius offers can make it possible for us to both be connected with that stillness and silence, and also be aware of the karmic and dharmic demands upon us that we either must or have to comply with, or that we choose to comply with in action in the world. Now, everybody's journey with that is going to be really different. You know, not all of us can be like medics on the front line, or doing any one of hundreds of other actions that are heroic to the point where I don't even know what to say. Now, I'm sure some people would think I was quite mad with what I'm about to say now. Hey, I don't mind. Too old for that.
Great, go for it.
But you know, I know more than one person who makes it part of their spiritual practice to, when watching or listening to news reports on the media, will deliberately make that into a prayer session, and the work that they will try to do will be to witness and to hold the space and to perhaps send prayers for a specific person, a place, a country, the earth. You know, there's plenty that needs our prayers at the moment. So I do know people who've, instead of getting reactive and upset and anxious and angry and all the myriad of quite normal, understandable reactions to some of the stuff that's going on, right? Have the temperament or have the dharma to work with that on a subtle level in whatever way makes sense to you. It's very individual once you chunk it all the way down to me and my life and what can I do and who am I in the middle of all this, and all those important questions. So finding one's own thread is something that one way or another will occur. And so in the transcending or the going beyond the dualism that we're all having to deal with, because we live on the plane of duality and we ignore that at our peril, we have to pay attention. But that doesn't mean that we have to be imprisoned by a materialistic way of thinking. There are other realms and other dimensions, and even though we can't possibly understand it all, and there is no uniformity about this and that and what happens after you die, or even about the chakra system, etc., you can get royally confused checking out different sources on this. If you manage to stay with this sense of presence that we're referring to, that can potentially be a very inclusive place. And so it doesn't exclude you being radically active. That kind of stillness at its core does not exclude you being radically reactive. But if that's not your way, then it's not going to do you any good to follow a path where you really don't have a vocation for. It's not your job. And to be able to truly acknowledge that what happens on the subtle levels absolutely does make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not everybody can do that or is interested in that. But I know personally, I know people who are. And so that, that way of thinking is very challenging to some people. For others, it's just natural, normal. So that would be my response to that.
Beautiful.
We can't all do everything. We're just not cut out for it. But we do have our individual thread. Rings, I'm just thinking, little theme about rings. Rings can be seen as something symbolizing definition, but marking out a particular territory, as in Saturn and Jupiter. They define particular territories that do link us with the world and so forth. Mm. And I mean, Saturn is also the lord of limits, both in a negative sense of feeling cramped and constrained, etc., but also in a positive sense, where without being able to set limits and respect them, none of us would ever manifest anything. Because sometimes you have to make choices between this or that, and one of them has to go. So we can't be in all places at all times. That's up to the Almighty, and our job is much more limited than that, which doesn't mean that it's important, that it's not important. It is.
Yeah. And we're all in this together. That's something I try to remind myself of too. It's
yes,
in
I
a
love
sense,
it. Spoken like a true Pisces. I love it.
Chris, what about you?
In the background of my mind has been a question you asked about an hour ago, Martha. I think some time ago, some way back in the river, and it's actually something I've thought of a lot with Chariklo's story and those playing out Chariklo dynamics in a more sort of specific way. I think about people that are, say, connected to somebody that is in pain, or somebody who is of the genius, sort of pained, tormented genius, but has that partner who is able to actually be there and be with. And when I heard your question, I heard it in a way that I've asked and been asked about this as well, of who's there for Chariklo, in a way. That's what I heard as your question.
Yeah.
How does she and I think it's a really important question for those kind of in that calling. I do think it's a vocation and a calling. It's like, somebody who's called to assist and be there and hold space for that one who's doing the Chiron.
Yeah.
And I think in our modern day, we may have lost the value of that position. We may have lost the idea that is a very valuable and beautiful and wondrous like exceptional life.
Mm.
And I think we think instead of like that as a helpless, like thankless task, you know, this endless, and which it can be, right? Like, I mean, and sometimes we go into Chariklo positions for several years or for several months or weeks or whatever it might be. If we've got to be there for somebody who's dying, or, you know, I can think of, you know, my mom and her mom, my grandmother's 105 years old, you know, and the constancy of having to show up and be abused pretty much now. That's how that my mum is pretty, her in her experience with her mum, she's just so unraveled in her mind. And so every day she goes, every day she gets something of an unpleasant experience. And that's a Chariklo like having to kind of like come back and again, and there's nobody really giving us some big thanks, and there's nobody really holding that for her. So as I've been holding your question and spending about an hour in the conversation, also hanging out with that in the background, I think it's something that Melanie's referring to as well, of Chariklo's like ethereal nature, where because she hovers in between worlds, I think that her support is from the all that is, in a way. You know, she's very much in between worlds, and she's kind of in a position, maybe as I'm seeing it, where there's not really a her there to need extra layers of support, if you know what I mean. There's something of the fluid nature of her being, that although that doesn't give much solace to those, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, you know, but it doesn't give all that much solace when you are in that position where it's just like ongoing care and nurturing. And often for somebody who has been abusive towards you, or, you know, whatever it may be, that you're in that position. Because I think the question comes up for me of like, is there honor in that role, or should that person learn to be, you know, more assertive and live their own life, etc., etc. But the modern ideal sort of comes on top of it. But I think there's something beautiful inherent in the role itself and in the archetype itself. But I do think it's, your question sort of holds there as something that I don't think would be answered today. But I think there's an interesting angle on it of how we see that kind of a role in the modern day versus how we saw it maybe 60 years ago or something, or, you know, in different eras, we may have given more credence and more respect to those that were able to assist those genius types, those Aquarius types, to actually give their gift to the world, actually be the water bearers. And without somebody there able to hold all of that, we wouldn't actually have those gifts that we end up getting in the end. And is that gift in the end enough of a, you know, support back, or, you know, how does that, I don't know, that this is just kind of what I've been sitting with that. I think I'd love to bring honor back to that archetype, actually. Not that necessarily it's gone anywhere, but there's something of the beauty in that position, even though, you know, not being rose tinted glasses about it, I think it can be hard. I think Chariklo's, especially once Chiron was injured, I think that role would have been a whole different role when the blood of the Hydra is running through his veins and he's in extraordinary pain all the time. Then we're in a different part of her story, right?
And maybe one idea, again, I agree, probably this isn't answerable right this second necessarily, but one thing I'm feeling into as both of you are talking about it is, well, she's not alone, actually, right? She is held literally in our solar system by our solar system and by the cosmos. I mean, there's something so much more vast than her, but maybe she doesn't necessarily get held by the Saturnian world, but she's being held by everything else. And if she's that being, you know, holding space for the whole time space continuum, she is being held by source. Like, I mean, she is in the realm of the divine. Everything is, So she can, it's maybe we could think of her like, maybe one idea could be if we happen to be in that role, or we tend to take on that kind of role, maybe we could imagine, rather than looking to be nurtured or cared for like in a more direct way that we would maybe normally look for, maybe one idea, I don't know, could be we could imagine being held up by the light of source itself, or by the whole cosmos, or by this solar system, and we can lean back into something bigger, right? Like, as opposed to trying to get it directly from, I don't know.
Yeah.
I love that, Martha. Thank you.
Mm.
And also, Chris, when you just referred to the phrase, the water bearer, that had been with me for a few minutes, and then you said it. And to me, I find that deeply inspiring.
Do you want to say any more about that?
I'm just thinking of Aquarius as the water bearer. So there's the water, and then there's the container for the water, or the urn, or the jug, or however it's portrayed. And don't even know where I'm going with this, but indulge me a moment while I ramble. And so the water bearer is the one, the water bearer is the figure who holds both the urn and the water. So that makes me think of when we were talking a bit earlier about observation, about the kind of awakening, the kind of quantum awakening is recognized that what is observed, what is being observed, and the observer have an inextricably close and mutual exchange, that they're not separate from one another, even though, again, at the level of the five senses, it might look that way. And on a certain level, it is that way. There is water, and there is the urn, and there's the being, the person who is carrying that. And yet, we now know through quantum physics and other arcane things, we know that they're inextricably linked. And the time around which there was a recognized impact that the observer was having on the experiment that the observer was performing. I mean, that was like a Saturn-Uranus edge of the universe kind of thing, So that's what came to mind.
Beautiful.
And just following on from what you said, Chris, I remember when I was first really tuning in to Chariklo as best I could, it dawned on me that actually the world is full of Chariklos. It's just that nobody pays them any attention or values them necessarily. But the world is absolutely full of people.
And I think that's what I'm trying to refer to, the valuing of that again. If you know what I mean. Because we put and that brings us to the sort of Venus part of this, maybe values, and as Venus and Mars come together in Aquarius, where we put our values, right? And how have we, even like likes and likes as a currency, because that's that's fairly new, right? This thing that we have going on. This is a very new medium, but some of the kids coming up in this world, they just assume that is what the currency is, right? The number of likes means better and less likes worse, and that's just such a obviously skewed value system, because surely we're, it's isn't that one of the most obvious messages is, approval and recognition is not what we're aiming for here, right? That's not what we're going for. It's to really hone the craft. It's to really kind of like pay attention inwardly. There's so many things that are so valuable that you'll never get the likes, and you'll never get the hits, and you'll never get the money, and you'll never get the material reward for. And I think there's that time maybe with Pluto in Aquarius of, well, we got to address this reward punishment system that we have in place that's making things shallower and shallower and shallower and shallower. Right? We're just getting like the Cyclops. There's less and less depth perception, and like the Hecatonchires is more and more doing, more and more content, more and more creation, but less and less depth. And this is a really horrifying direction to be going. But we have a structure that's set up to support it going in that direction. And it's as simple as those, like a currency being approval as a currency. Terrible, right? I mean, there's something intrinsic and inherent about approval as a currency, but to actually have it in the world operating like it is, and with financial reward and all that kind of stuff, it's a worrying direction. And I'd be interested to see how we correct such a course. Maybe Pluto in Aquarius will show us how universal forces want to correct a course like that, because it needs correcting.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you raised that theme. Really, I do have maybe this is an idealistic hope, but I do have the hope that Pluto in Aquarius will not just offer, but maybe force. It may happen through force, and that could be internal or external. That the potential destructiveness of things like what you've just described, Chris, and many other things we could point to, will become so blindingly obvious to more and more and more people.
Yeah.
That, as space opens up around some of the things happening in the world today, more and more people will be able to see it.
Yeah.
Some people who may be more of the intrepid explorer type on the mental level have known about some stuff for a long time. But not everybody has, and that's not because they're stupid. But it's just becoming so obvious. So you know how one kind of Pluto process can be the revealing of what is toxic, the revealing of what is destructive, and so forth. And so here, if we put him in Aquarius, wow, my hope would be that the destructive side of collectivity and so-called community, will be revealed and revealed and revealed.
Yeah.
And there I'm thinking of Leo as the polarity to Aquarius. So some mirroring of what's going on in the Leo realm is going to be part of that. It's like pick your tyrant. Sort of thing.
And then Chariklo moves relatively slowish, so she'll be. I mean, she won't. Maybe Melanie. When she'll be in Aquarius, she'll be following ahead. She'll be moving ahead of Pluto for probably a few more years. Do you know when she enters Pisces?
No, not offhand.
But she's moving pretty slowly right now.
Yes.
So
yes.
It'll be a little good while, but she's still kind of there.
Yeah, it's just a few years, but certainly isn't immediate. But I suddenly thought, wow, well, of course, she moved ahead of Pluto a few years back already, because they were conjunct all the way through 1 year. I believe it was 2019.
Oh, really? In Capricorn.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's a whole other thread to go down. Wow. Which we won't do right this second, but
Indeed, no, we won't do that now.
Chris needs to go to sleep. Oh dear. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, as usual, I feel like this could go on for many more hours.
Forever. Yeah. Forever.
Forever.
We will definitely
Like,
need to do this
and
again.
like this kind of this realm of eternal astrological conversations
Uh,
where one can just dip in every
Yeah.
now and again, you know.
Yeah, it's so great. I love it though. And I'm also noticing, as the sun goes farther and farther and farther under your horizon, Chris, um, what has just risen here in California as we've been talking was first Pluto, then Venus and Mars
Oh,
and Chariklo, and then the sun, right? Like it's like I've just had my
perfect.
sunrise with the Venus, Mars, Pluto rise. So
Oh, perfect.
I know it's so perfect. And I think it's really, really fascinating and interesting to me that as Mars and Venus will be meeting, they are both early morning dawn stars. So they're meeting in the dawn in a sense, right? Like,
mm.
I don't know. That's pretty cool. Yeah, so that's what just happened for me here in California.
Wonderful.
Mhm. Any last thoughts that feel like they need to be said before we close for now?
I just want to just offer the little mythological vignette because I love this one for Mars, Venus coming together, and maybe particularly in Aquarius. And because one of the things that for some reason is just hovering around, and I don't know why in particular, but is around shame. And I think one of the keys of moving through this bifurcation and like the stuck in this side and that is to move through shame dynamics, to move through what is there. And I love the only real Mars Venus as in Aphrodite and Ares story that is kind of like a famous one, or that I know really well. It is that moment, because Aphrodite, who's Venus, she's married off to Hephaestus, who's the sort of lame smith god in Tartarus. So she's obviously, that's not her ideal partner. So instead of staying faithful to him, she has many love affairs. As we know, Aphrodite isn't one to be kind of stuck in a bad marriage. And one of her partners was Ares. So that's where Mars and Venus come together, right? Ares and Aphrodite come together. And Hephaestus wasn't too happy about this. He'd sort of picked up through the grapevine that it was happening. And so one day he sets this sort of prison for them, or this trap for them. And then he says he's going to go off to Olympus for a few days, or go off on blazing a trail, doing something for a few days. He won't be back for a while. And so as soon as he leaves, Mars enters, and then Venus and Mars get together in bed, and then a cage pops up. And so then Mars and Venus are hanging from the ceiling in a cage, and Hephaestus pops back in, and he calls all the gods and the goddesses, and he pulls them all in to lay shame on them, right? So the whole purpose of his thing was like, now look at this, like my wife is cheating on me, and look with Mars, this whole thing, this whole big scene. And so all of the gods and goddesses are there, and everybody's kind of like, whoa, this is a pretty intense scene going on here, except for Hermes or Mercury. And Hermes is able to make this Hermes is able to make this perfectly off-key joke at that moment. And it just kind of like he says something like, oh, what I wouldn't give to get in my brother's place there. Like even if it is in a cage, I'd love to be there with Aphrodite naked. That would be the best. Everybody has a little chuckle. And in that chuckle, the whole map, the whole plan of shame is kind of dispersed and diminished. And it's no longer possible for Hephaestus to use his shame routine because of the humor that Hermes was able to bring in. So I just feel I may have even brought that story up in a previous thing that we've done. I don't know if I did. But anyway, I love that kind of like little bit of humor, you know, done well at the right moment, sometimes a little bit inappropriate, sometimes of that, like bringing back that sense of humor, because I think we're going to need that over this next little while. And a little bit of humor can go a long way, as happens in a lot of these myths where you see humor being used not as a way to avoid and not as a way to get out of and not as a way to diminish and or any of those kinds of things, but if it's done right, which is an art form in itself, right, it can ripple through and clear out some of that, you know, we talk about that toxic emotional state where you just feel like trapped and imprisoned. And perhaps part of that Aquarian ideal as well. I mean, the story always to me feels very Gemini and Hermes and everything, but still it can lift us up out of that sort of really, really dark, shadowy place, and help us to feel that aliveness again, and to feel kind of a bit more of that forgiveness of ourselves and others as we move through the processes of what effectively is going to be a bit of a collective reckoning over the next little while. You know, I think having enough humor in the tank can be a good way through.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And probably most people watching will have heard of Swami Beyond Ananda, website wakeuplaughing.com. And if you don't know his work, well, you really might just have a treat in store. I don't think I know anyone else who can play with humor in such a way that, just as Chris was saying, that it's totally not dissociative, it's not mocking, it's not distracting, but it's really with the cosmic principles of what is happening. It's the best way I can say it. And for me, he's the funniest man on the planet. I've never once heard him use humor there's no aggression in this humor. It really is like a capacity to sense the play of the divine and to remind us about what is really happening. And so I hope you enjoy that if you follow that suggestion.
Do you think maybe that's part of the balance of Leo too, is to remind us to like play and laugh?
Yes, to play.
Have fun. Yeah.
And loved listening to that story, Chris, about Ares and Aphrodite. Just two flashes came to me when you spoke about the cage and being lifted up. I thought, oh God, that's like, you know, going to the realm of the sky gods, being lifted up. And then the shame about the perfectionism that is part of the Cyclops thing with the one-pointedness. And if you step off that rail, or if you fail, God forbid, or if you're imperfect, God forbid, you know, then that Cyclop energy generates a lot of shame. And at the same time, the astronomy, the recent astronomy, with Hermes being the first one into that crucible, that almost kind of leads the others into that crucible of transformation. And then there's the Mars-Venus conjunction in the middle.
Yeah, that's what really, as soon as we started the session, I that story really popped in. So I thought I'd better not leave it out. Because of Hermes coming in first, right? He's the one that's going to lead us. He could lead us astray, but you know, he's still going to lead us regardless.
Yeah.
So yeah, I always go back to that story because I think shame, you know, like ways to work through shame, stories to help us work through shame. Because then we can get back into what Mars and Venus is really about, right? Which is creativity. It's creating. That's the most creative combinations, that not when you get those two together. You know, then we've got this ability to really get going again, right? Like get our creative minds back on the tasks at hand and what have you. But the shame is like those two in the cage. And I wonder if that image of these two finally coming together, do they come together and get caught in a cage, or do they come together to really be free? I'm not sure.
Oh, that's beautiful, Chris. Wow, yeah. Lots to think about with that.
Love it.
Yeah, and what is the cage? Well, on one level, it's ideologies, isn't it? Our
Yeah.
thoughts and ideas about what we think we're doing,
Mm-hmm.
or the things we think that we know, and really we don't. You know.
Which comes full circle to what we were just talking
Yes.
the whole time. So good. So perfect. All right. So, yeah, so just to say on the logistical, practical level of things, obviously with this video, if you want to be in touch with Melanie or Chris or me, all of our information is here. And I will mention briefly that, again, Melanie and Chris are both part of this astrology course that I am hosting that just began there, and there's a little tiny bit more room if people want to join. But Chris's part actually is going to be, it's going to be possible to join just Chris's part, even if you're not part of the whole astrology course with me. And that's going to begin on March 9th. And I'll put the link and you can find out more about that. But basically, you know, Chris is going to be doing this deep dive into the mythology of the various signs and planets throughout this whole year. So it's going to be a 12-month series with Chris. We're calling it a fireside chat. And yeah, I'm so excited about it. And then Melanie's part is going to come in July, where you're going to be giving a talk to be determined a little bit, but you know, something having to do with centaurs and Chiron and all of that. So if anybody's interested in any of that, certainly join. And do either of you want to mention anything specific about anything that you're doing?
No, just tune into the podcast where Martha's on there. She's going to be coming in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. So yes, I'll just say this. I mean, and Melanie, I'm sure agrees. Chris's podcast, if you have not looked at it, on the soul's term, right? On the soul's
On the soul's terms.
Yeah. I'll put that link obviously here too. It's so exquisitely beautiful. I mean, truly, Chris, you've done such an amazing job.
Thank you.
And Melanie, yeah. So you have so far this year, you're about to finish with Pisces, but you started last year with Aries, and you went month by month, where you correct me if I'm wrong, you have one podcast per month where it's just you talking about that archetype and mythology associated, and then you interview someone who you associate with that particular archetype. And so Melanie, Gemini month, and now you've done me the honor of inviting me to be your Pisces month to close out the year.
Yeah, and there's some really great guests throughout the year, Melanie being one of them. I had Saffron Rossi on last week, who was amazing as my Aquarian guest, and Michael Mead was my Capricorn guest. Brian Clark was on there for Libra, Jason Holly for Scorpio. I mean, it was a really great year. And we're going to be finishing it off, you and I together, Martha, which is very exciting.
Beyond honored.
Pisces.
That's an amazing group of people to follow. Yeah, so but truly, it's like listening to poetry and depth. And you know, I said this in, I think, the very first interview you and I ever did, but my now 17-year-old loves you simply because I had him listen to, I think, like 2 or 3 minutes of one of your podcasts, you know, months and months ago, because super perceptive, like highly Piscean being, and Aquarian actually, and he picks up on people's quality through their sound, through the sound of their voice, really immediately. Very convinced that you're amazing, and it's all through your podcast. So, and I agree. So there we go. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Yeah. Right, and Melanie goes without saying, beyond wonderful. And yeah. Okay, great. Well, to be continued, I'm sure, another time down the road. And we would love to hear your thoughts. Everybody listening, please feel free to comment and join in the conversation in any way you feel called. Would be wonderful. Thank you both so much.
Thank you both.
Mhm.
Thank you, guys.